Thank you, everybody. As we kind of rattle through some phenomenal content this afternoon, we're now going to lurch from fintech and insurtech into the world of health tech. So this picks up another sector that's seen some pretty heavy investment and also some pretty hard lessons. So where does health tech sit? It's sort of that intersection of clinical outcomes, regulation, reimbursement, human behavior, all those vectors. So it's a space where pilots are easy to announce and much harder to turn into scaled deployments and sustainable economics. So against that backdrop, capital has become more selective, and the bar for evidence, both clinical and also commercial, has risen sharply. So in this conversation, I'm hoping that we'll unpack where the investable opportunities are now across digital health, medtech, data-driven care, perhaps how founders can navigate regulators and health systems without losing momentum, and what investors are actually looking for before they commit to a health tech story in 2026. So Adel, if you want to take it from here and introduce yourself and the panel, look forward to half an hour of content. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming. My name is Adel. My background is I was a practicing physician for 20 years in the NHS, and since then I've been scaling AI in healthcare for the last decade, primarily focused on the US, but essentially globally. So you could say I've seen a thing or two in that time. But I've got a fantastic panel today, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. We have a policymaker, we have a couple of founders, we have an investor, so I think there's going to be plenty of room for some honest disagreement. Perhaps if I start with Manish.
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Manish. I'm CEO co-founder of Jiva. I'm probably a little bit different from everyone else in that we're not actually a health tech company. We're an AI platform, but we do a lot in healthcare and life sciences. I have 25 years of experience in AI and machine learning, and don't really know much else, to be honest.
Well, I'm not David. So my name's Rami. David does send his apologies, but I work very closely with him. I'm a policymaker, as you say, and I'm primarily focused on the sort of medtech adoption challenge. The question I try and answer every day is, why is the NHS such a difficult customer? So I spent about 7 years in the Department of 7 years in the Department of Health and Social Care. So I've also seen some things, and I was a private secretary for the majority of that to various health ministers throughout the COVID pandemic. I did an MBA during all of that madness at Imperial, and I joined David sort of on the condition that I'd be solely focused on the adoption challenge. So looking forward to sort of that. I think the key interest as well that I have is how to make the UK more investable. So really interested to hear about the perspectives and yes, and some disagreements and hear where there's definitely room for the UK government to support more.
Hi everyone, I'm Vanela. I'm on the investor side of things. Scientist turned investor, turned operator, and then turned investor again. I've been in this space for the last 18 years, investing and operating across healthcare and life sciences. At the moment, I'm founder and managing partner at Dendriti Capital. We are a new firm that's just rebranded, relaunched. Our investment thesis focuses on the intersection of computation, tech, digital, and human health. So obviously, today is very topical as part of what we invest in. Very much looking forward to the various perspectives in this panel. Really pleased to be here.
Hi everybody, my name is Sebastian Vaughan. I'm the CEO of a company called Phytome Life Sciences. I'll start there. So that's a company that's focused fundamentally on developing technologies to unlock the manufacturing of medicines in plants and fungi and scaling those at to industrial scale so that we can manufacture and develop complex medicines that have been until now actually trapped with the chemical synthesis problem that pharmaceutical companies have. On the other side of that, I also am the founder of an organization called the Botanical Medicine Research Collaborative, and that's actually fundamentally focused in on healthcare. So actually providing, if you like, the next generation understanding of how we deliver healthcare from a precision population health point of view, using data and AI and all of these things that I'm sure we'll hear a lot of today, to actually deliver transformative forms of care with a fundamental focusing on mental health and actually the psychedelics, of some of which we're manufacturing and developing within Phytome. My career, I started as an academic at Imperial College, developing novel cancer therapeutics. I've spent some time at Harvard Medical School, developing health technology platforms. And so I've been here, there, and everywhere, all over the world, and currently have a lot of work going on in the Middle East as well, related to their huge push for innovation, health tech, longevity. So happy to talk across all of those different parts.
Great, fantastic. So really a veteran panel today, and it sounds like you've all been in different roles at different times of your career, so really have that kind of generalist exposure, which I think is really great. So perhaps if I start off by kicking off the panel by addressing the question, really the first question to everyone, which is, the pandemic has really supercharged health tech investment. I know, I was there. And then the market has corrected pretty hard since then. And I was hearing this in the last panel as well on, fintech and insurtech. So it's definitely a theme. What do you think the new rules are for building a health tech company now? And is there a risk that we've gone too conservative? Don't know if anyone wants to volunteer.
Shall I go first? Being the non-health tech company here, we do, like I said, we work with a lot with health tech companies, and the way I see it is this: the liquidity pool and the appetite for risk in other countries like the US and China and India outstrips UK by an order of magnitude. And I think we just have to make peace with that fact. We're not going to get that level of venture in the UK. So the only real way to make it work here is to leverage what we have in abundance, which is a great ecosystem of other startups that can support one another, the NHS, supporting systems, lobby groups like the BIA, for which I actually also have a role at. And all of those together enable small companies, SMEs, anything up to 50 employee type of size, to be able to do some amazing things without needing to have access to incredible amounts of capital. We've got all the components here to make that work, and it's just about having the right network, which is why having these kind of discussions in this kind of room is very important.
I'd love to provide like a government perspective. So looking at it from, I like to describe COVID sometimes as very much a medtech story, because that was, at least from where I was sitting, the most drastic transformation in healthcare delivery. Definitely big changes on pharma as well, but on digital health and on moving from pathology labs to people's bathrooms, and it was just such a huge shift. But I think there were 4 sort of observations that I made reflecting on this about what companies have learned, what the survivors, if you like, have learned from that market correction. The first is the sort of the blitzscaling approach is just really, really difficult in the UK, and I think instead the companies that prioritized revenue over growth were more likely to to sort of signal that they had a credible path and profitability, credibility. I think the focus on evidence as well, not as a sort of a it will come in due course, but actually as a prerequisite to market entry, almost as a sort of foundation, not a feature to then build. I think the payer integration over customer as well is worth mentioning. I think the thinking about the NHS sort of commissioners as the main focus rather than necessarily customers themselves. We talked a lot during COVID about the democratization of healthcare and how the NHS customer would have more and more power, but I think possibly oversold, and the NHS still kind of reigns supreme when it comes to its role as a payer. Those were the sort of initial reflections.
Yeah, no, really interesting. You mentioned something about establishing the evidence base and the clinical validity before going to market, and I guess from my experience, I've had some mixed experiences of that. It's it's the how far do you have to go in that, and we'll sort of come to the regulatory aspect in a moment. But just perhaps Vanela, jumping over to you, what have you seen in digital health companies that actually bridge that gap between the clinical evidence and the commercial traction? You know, how do you get that balance right? What's the commonest reason for that bridge to fail, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually a very critical question when looking at companies that make it and end up succeeding versus the ones that end up being academic experiments, right? Building a little bit on the previous question, yes, we went from an environment of abundance, maybe to some extent, irrationality, yes, to retrenchment of capital. So obviously what that means, and we are still in that environment, particularly as it relates to digital health, what that means for companies is that they've had to navigate the balance between speed and rigor in a very different way. And how they bridge that gap between evidence and commercial traction, that's led to some creative thinking, right? Yes, evidence creation early on. I think the companies that end up succeeding are the ones that, from the outset, make clinical evidence part of their commercial strategy, right? It has to be part of their go-to-market. It has to be part of their thinking in terms of how they commercialize their products. It can't be an afterthought. And a lot of that evidence generation can start very early on. It can be as simple as having good KOL adoption, having the right KOLs back you, publishing your data, and then when you're doing pilots, whether that's with the NHS or other payers, making sure that you are continuing to generate evidence, you're continuing to generate real-world evidence, and presenting that as part of your overall evidence package. Making sure that you get to those paying pilots early on and showing that commercial traction early on. And the more nimble you are in navigating that transition, the higher the success rate is, at least from an investment standpoint. Now, I know we've got some other questions coming up in terms of what that means and what that means in the concept of NHS, etc. It is hard. It's hard to put that in practice, particularly if you're bound to a single payer type of environment. But certainly in the current environment, when there isn't a lot of capital going around, those are the companies that make it, right? Showing early traction early on, having those those pilots that are paying, having those customers that are embedded in what you're doing, and making sure that everything has the right rigor from a clinical standpoint, and generating data, continuing to generate data as part of your strategy.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think, you know, being on the sharp end of sales as well for the last several years, really the conversations move from, hey, this is a great shiny new thing, let's try it out, even in the US, I would say, to, is it going to save us money, is it going to make us money? If you're talking to providers and payers, payers and providers actually. So that's really interesting. Just jumping, apologies, jumping back to, from a policymaker standpoint, healthcare procurement traditionally or historically or has this reputation as you know, as soon as you know you mentioned the word NHS, everyone winced in the audience. Where's the biggest opportunity to fix it? And where do you think the resistance is just too deep for startups?
I'll be very honest here. I think the diagnosis is fragmentation. I think the NHS today versus where it was 25 years ago is far more fragmented and devolved to a local level, to the point now I think where about 90% of spend on medical technology, it occurs at the local level. And there's various sort of consequences to that devolution. There's good reasons for a devolved health system like this as well, but it does throw up patterns that we see in other devolved markets as well. Like, for example, we tend to see the same health tech across the NHS bought at widely different prices in an unwarranted way, so not justified by different sort of local level needs. We see evaluation processes that are quite duplicative and slow, resource intensive, and often reinventing the wheel each time. We tend to see decisions that are sort of driven by clinical preference, which perhaps is right, but then sometimes incumbent relationships, and you know, and that's sort of being given more precedent over outcome evidence. And then lastly, a long sort of tail of legacy contracts that crowd out innovation. And as I say, this isn't sort of unique to the UK or the NHS, but I think what you see fragmented markets like Italy and Spain and similar sort of trends, but where it really matters for the UK is the NHS is such, the scale of the NHS makes this issue matter a lot, because the inefficiency is really significant. I have a sort of positive side to the question as well, which is, we are thinking quite a lot in government about how to improve these structural barriers. I think tech can be an enabler as well, which is exciting. We have two interventions in particular to call out. One is value-based procurement, which I think maybe is probably well known about already, but essentially sort of shifting away from unit cost as the religion in the NHS and instead towards true value. I sort of like to compare it as, sort of instead of asking what does this cost, instead you pose the question, what does this deliver relative to cost? And so we're excited to roll out value-based procurement at more scale. And it is a genuine shift in procurement, but it needs to be coupled, I think, with giving buyers the right tools, and that's where an initiative like Compass can really meet a need. Compass is a digital infrastructure to enable that shift and give buyers a data and benchmarking tool to compare products on a sort of in a standardized way. I'd sort of like summarize it as if you can't standardize the buyer because of the local health system that we have, then what you can do is you can standardize the process and then equip the buyer with the right tool to do it. So, yeah.
I think, no, that's a great answer. I think the way somebody very seasoned commercial colleague of mine put it is selling to the NHS is kind of like it's a patchwork quilt. And a lot of that arises from, it's historical really, it's the way it was built and created. But it's great to, I've definitely seen a shift certainly in the last few months and year that I've never seen before in the NHS. So I'm holding promise still. Perhaps this is a good point to move over to you, Sebastian. What's it actually like building a life sciences company in the UK, and where are the real advantages, and where do we fall short against some of the international markets you were sort of speaking about?
So as a builder and a founder, my capital is my time and my attention, if you like, rather than my money. And so actually I ask myself a fundamental question first is, am I working on something that's still going to be here in 6, 12 months' time? And actually being in something that is real rather than virtual. If you just heard the fintech talk, this learning loops and the cycles are so fast that people are almost stepping away from thinking, what's real and what can we invest in? And actually biology, life or death, food, wellness is actually something which will continue alongside this AI evolution. And so it's a great parallel to be investing in biology, healthcare, and all of those different things. So I'm committed on building in this space because I believe it is going to become fundamentally more important over time. However, the interesting thing is it's going to turn everything on its head. So everything you've heard about the NHS, it's going to be super slow, but ultimately everything's going to change around it and the NHS is going to have to catch up. And so as a builder, I don't worry about the NHS so much anymore. I'm worried about what's my global marketplace for my product, because that's the market that matters to me today. So why am I talking to the guys in the Dubai Investment Authority or in Saudi Arabia or in the US or Singapore? It's actually because I don't have to, it's a bit like thinking the Earth is the center of the universe if all you're thinking about is the NHS. Guess what? They're going to prove you wrong in about, 3 months' time or something like that. And so it's never been a more challenging time to build a business in this space, but it's never been a more exciting and open potential to be able to reinvent what we're thinking about. And so for me, from a regulatory point of view, I think you're going to see a fundamental evolution towards a data-driven approach to thinking about value in healthcare, value-based healthcare, precision health, population healthcare. And that is going to be interesting because it's going to bring the technology companies as real power players, as they already are, but ultimately data handlers and technologies are going to start to drive how we think about healthcare, rather than the actual point of care being the fundamental roadblock, if you like. So I think as a builder, it's never been a more exciting time. And so from my point of view, global capital matters. The UK, really, if I'm going to focus in on your question about the UK specifically, the UK is about intellectual capital. It's no longer about investment capital, as you mentioned earlier, Manish. So from that point of view, leverage everything we have here. And if we're thinking of it as UK PLC, my preference is to start to think about innovation investment bridges across multiple countries, so that we are, I believe we're still the best technology developers. Some of the best thinkers in the world are in the UK. That's what we're selling. And so as a builder, I'm looking to build alliances and convene the right people to go and do groundbreaking things in healthcare and in biology, biotech, to be able to strike partnerships where we are holding the intellectual property and leveraging that for our own benefit in the UK to do more of what we do best. But then the innovation investment can come from different parts of the world where we're co-developing and creating co-beneficiary outcomes from that. And I think that really enables us to the NHS is still seen as like the global leading light everywhere in the world. Wherever I go, and there's two things about that. One is we do some things incredibly well. The other is that we can use it as an example of how we leapfrog what we don't do well. And so it's a perfect, mature case study that we can also go and leverage as well. So I think the UK, from my point of view, I love being in the UK. I love the intellectual capabilities. But from an investment and a growth point of view, I'm looking at building companies that can go from UK only in a very short space of time to global and very quickly. And I also think what's going to change is the startup lens is actually going to become the petri dish of developing health tech rather than universities over time, because you need certain amounts of capital, to your point, to go improve these things at real serious pace. And then you need to be able to deploy quickly. So that sort of slightly sclerotic, slow process of academia developing, spinning out and everything else, I see that being incredibly, that learning loop is going to be shortened and accelerated, and therefore it's going to become a really interesting sort of accelerated evolutionary process that's going to happen in this short space of time around health tech. The challenge is going to be how regulators interact with that to actually engage and benefit and transform healthcare. That's going to be a really interesting tension.
Can I just quickly add to that? I completely agree with you. Being a builder is so exciting at the moment. I'm super excited about the innovations that are coming out of the UK and globally, to be frank. But going back to the point around NHS, as a company, if the premise of what you're building is based on a single payer system, you have a geography problem, right? So the NHS is a great testbed for technologists. It's a great validator as well. And I completely agree with you that the prestige that comes with having worked with NHS is great. However, if as a company builder you are relying on NHS as your customer, you are dead. There's no other way to put it. So yes, use the NHS as a pilot, but then start getting paying customers from the Middle East, the US. That's what we encourage companies to do. Unfortunately, this is the reality of how things are at the moment with the NHS. The procurement cycles are too long. It's 2 years plus, right? And no startup in the current environment, with the current capital levels being committed in the space, can survive those cycles. And especially in the UK, capital levels are becoming even more entrenched. So you have to think outside of the UK from a funding perspective.
Well, I think, Sebastian, I agree with many points you mentioned, and I think some of the frontier models, some of the biggest companies in the world probably agree with you, so why they're building some of the biggest campuses in Europe just down the road in King's Cross. So we've definitely got the talent. I think that's what I'm hearing. We've got the science, we've got Cambridge, the tech Cambridge hub, we've got all the talent here, but capital, it seems to be, should that be the only reason people
capital
leave?
Constraint is not a bad thing for builders. It's a good thing because it makes you value what is most important as your next experiment. The trouble is, we think about investment almost like an MBA study that is so out of date. And if you take a more, what is the most important question I need to ask next to validate or kill my project, the investors are going to really like talking to you.
I agree, but I think the pendulum has swung too far.
Okay.
You need to get the balance right, right? Because it's, if as a startup, you're raising with a 2-year investment runway horizon, right? and you can't even get the funding to get you there to survive the next, procurement cycle with your buyer.
I agree. That's
Right?
true. That's in some way, that's the minimal.
The balance has to be right. Yes, I completely agree with you. If you are in a effervescent funding environment, that leads to crazy behaviors, right? You only need to look at what's happening at the moment with AI and so on. You need that capital efficiency. Here in Europe, we're very good at it. We're amazing at it. However, I do think in the current environment, the pendulum has swung a bit too far.
Fair.
Perhaps if we move on, I wanted to move back to Manish. There's a lot of talk about AI sovereignty, and I think this is I really wanted to cover this question because it comes up it's related to what we've been talking about, which is particularly in the health tech space. It's can the UK and Europe realistically build competitive AI systems here, or do we have to rely on foundational models abroad? And what if something goes wrong with that contract? What happens to patient safety? So are we all going to just end up being dependent on US models and infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the short answer is no, we can't. And the reason is similar to what you just said, which is actually you need huge amounts of capital to be able to build a foundational model. And there is just not enough investor appetite to do that. Maybe there are a couple of examples where, we have a couple of companies in Europe and the UK that are actually building foundational models. But to compete with the Anthropics of the world, to compete with the OpenAIs of the world is very difficult. The big deal here, actually, with sovereignty is this, that, I was just at another event last week and they were saying one of the NHS trusts has started using Copilot to do something. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, you're still using a Microsoft product. The US Cloud Act is still going to come into force at some point. When they want to open up your database to see your data, they're going to be able to do it. It doesn't matter where your data is. It doesn't matter that your data is located in a UK data center. Microsoft is compelled to give them that data. So your data is never actually safe with a proprietary model. So when I say, no, we don't have the capacity to build a foundational model, I think that's still true, but we can build things that come close. There are a lot of open source, open weight models out there. There are a lot of companies that know how to make those things work well and to make them work on-prem. That technology is being built. We're building it. I know a number of other companies building it in Europe. That technology is where I think Europe and the UK can sit very, very well. How do you get GPT, Anthropic, or Opus 4.6 like performance without using an API call that goes over to the US to do something? I think that's a real great piece of innovation and research that the UK is working on, that Europe is working on, and will make incredible progress in the next couple of years, in my opinion.
If you go to the Bay Area, though, there's people who are building their own little AI stacks in their garage.
Oh, yeah,
and
small.
running on-prem, So if you're a health tech innovator, and you've got a little bit of nous and the right people around you, you can go and demonstrate this in a completely safe sandbox with very little capital using an open source model.
Literally like a one little GPU, like we built one little small model, 7B model, did some coding with it, it was great, and you don't need a huge amount of capital for it.
Absolutely. I mean, the moat you can build with these local systems, right? So even UK, Europe more broadly, is around the data, right? So you can build a real data moat. And then really focus on that application layer. But can we compete with the capital levels that these companies are getting in the US? No, I mean, that's just
well, and the other point I think that's important, I think, for everyone to know actually is not just about the sovereignty piece, but actually LLMs by themselves, for every dollar that's being spent on optimizing a large language model, the incremental increase in performance is actually going down. So you're seeing a leveling off of performance of all LLMs, no matter how much you can keep increasing the number of parameters. So I do think the next couple of years, there's a real opportunity for European companies and UK companies to go in somewhere else.
Do you mind if I ask a question off the back of that, just on UK population and their reaction to AI? There was a study by the King's College recently that came out around where blame is attributed when AI goes wrong. And I think 58% of patients blamed the clinician or the hospital rather than the AI company or the tech. and I think only 6% actually blamed the AI company or the tech. So clearly trust matters, and I think clinicians are definitely worried about liability. So how does that compare as a population to other markets?
So I'm going to have to put my moderator hat on here, and this is a fascinating debate, and I really enjoying this. But perhaps if we move to the final question, which perhaps the audience would find quite tantalizing, is if you were to write one check into UK or European health tech tomorrow, given that there's so much noise out there in health tech, where would it go? Which subsector has probably soaked up too much capital than they'll return? I would say let's focus on where would you put your money right now? If you're
Do you want me to go for it?
If you're a betting guy.
So I think, to touch on what you've just said, I think experience of healthcare is going to be so important in the future. So if you want to invest in something real that isn't going to essentially evaporate overnight with an AI evolution or something like that, I actually think the point of care is going to transform in the next few years to something that is far more holistic, far more, what's the right words for it? Complete, in the sense that we're going to start to think of ourselves as a systems biology again, rather than fragmented, you've got a mental health issue, we've got many different parts of your body that we're going to treat, and it's going to take you 6 months to engage with all the different right parties. I think that's going to completely change. And so I imagine a healthcare system which is going to completely evolve its point of care, and I would be placing checks now into the fact that AI is going to accelerate that because of the data capabilities that we're going to have to be able to deliver healthcare in a very different way.
Great. Vanela.
Yes, and building on that point, actually, if you look at it from a tech stack perspective, I think where the opportunity really lies is in and around the infrastructure layer, right? And how you build that with what's happening at the moment with AI. So what that means in practice is perhaps less glamorous B2B businesses that are going after workflow optimization, how you optimize the infrastructure layer, how you connect the different data that are being created at the moment, really exciting biological data. And then how you link that in a way that makes sense from an end user perspective with then the AI application layer. So I completely agree with you. I think that it's really exciting what's happening at the moment.
It's a question, well, where would I invest? I feel like as a government official, I have to be a bit cautious here. If anybody is in the HSJ, it's David Lawson. You can quote me. I think I would just say that the government recognizes it's not the main character in this setting. So when we do get involved, we try to be quite surgical and more of as an enabler rather than like a buyer. But one thing I will say is we're doing a lot to try and give nice guidance and that kind of national evaluation more consequence and more meaning. So our National Health Tech Access Program is all basically about putting medtech and medicines on a more equal footing and having funding mandates follow nice recommendations. And there's other sort of things that nationally we're trying to do. So I would focus towards that kind of, those commitments in the life sciences sector plan around making the NHS a better customer and
Can I ask you how you think the NHS is going to keep up? Because, ultimately, isn't that the biggest bottleneck, is how are you going to keep up and stay relevant? Because to me...
It's a very unfair question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. On the reg side, on the evaluation side, on the evidence side, safe to say that a lot of our evaluation is actually retrofitted and is built for pharma, and we're figuring out how to fit it into the medtech space. And you're right, medtech is evolving faster than I think we're currently prepared to adapt to. So it's an ever-present challenge. All I would say, though, is that AI is emerging as a front runner in areas of prioritization, which is probably a good sign and what we'd want to see. But yeah.
And finally, Manish.
10 to 15 years is not AI. I think it's actually the next frontier, hardware and robotics. Robotic surgery, I think, is going to be a big deal.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Just remains for me to say thank you to the panel and everyone that came. I hope you found it interesting. I still remain very bullish about the UK market in terms of where health tech is going. To sum it up, when I was speaking to someone very high up in United a few months ago, he said, well, it's all very well to sell to the US, you know, we've got lots of money and you think we're stupid, but if you can sell to the NHS, there's got to be something of value there. So let's hope people still keep believing that. Thank you.